One moment at recess by Grace S. Pons.
She said Pons instead of Ponce.
It was 10 in the morning at Mabuhay Elementary School. It's time. It takes snacks. It was recess time.
She replaced the word its with is and replaced the word to with it. She said takes instead of take. She omitted the word a and said snacks instead of snack.
Pupils are lined up in waiting for their turns to go inside canteen.
The student said pupils instead of pupils. The student said in the line but successfully corrected herself and said our lineup. Instead of saying to, she said to. She omitted the word the.
Out of the road.
The student said crowd instead of crowd.
Joselito seems down at the bench looking around.
The name Joselito becomes Joselito. The student omitted the word just and repeated the word look.
The kids eating at same at playing.
The student said at instead of and. She also said same instead of some. And instead of saying are, she said at.
Hand no money buy something.
The student said hand instead of had and omitted the word to.
Because his father did not receive his salary yet.
Instead of saying receive, she said receive.
His mother told him to the healthy breakfast.
She said to instead of to. She replaced the word have with the. She omitted the word a. And instead of saying heavy, she said heavy.
For him to be full until lunchtime.
The student said pull instead of full.
While waiting for the time to pass by,
She said to instead of to.
he suddenly was 50 pesos on the ground.
The student said sud and successfully corrected herself and said suddenly. The reader said was instead of saw. She also said 50 instead of 50. The reader successfully corrected herself after saying a grow. It becomes ground.
He was to himself.
She replaced the word said into was and changed to into to.
Spend this money.
The word if was read as if and she omitted the word I.
I will be able to have notes too.
She repeated the word I and said table instead of able. She omitted the word to and instead of saying have, she said have. She said lots instead of lots and said to instead of to.
But he knows that it's not right thing to do.
She omitted the word the.
So he goes to their classroom.
Instead of saying he, she said his. Instead of saying to, he said to.
And ask for help from his advisor to find the owner of that money.
She omitted the letter S in the word asks. She said from instead of from. She also omitted the letter H in the word his. She said to instead of to.
It so happens that one of his classmates in Win.
She added letter S in the word one. The reader mispronounced the word Irene into Inrine.
Was crying at the corner of their classroom
She repeated the word classroom.
because it's not her money.
She said is instead of she and omitted the letter S in the word lost.
Joselito as in how much is lost.
She said Joselito instead of Joselito. She pronounced the word asks as as. She said in instead of Irene. She said is instead of she and said lost instead of lost.
It's 50 pesos shade in green.
The reader also read 50 as 50 and said shade instead of said. She also mispronounced the name Irene into Inrin.
Joselito gives in 50 pesos that saw to Inri and said it thinks it's yours.
She said Joselito instead of Joselito. Instead of saying gives, she said gaves. She replaced the word the with in and said 50 instead of 50. She omitted the word he, but successfully corrected herself after saying saw and said so. She said to instead of to and said Inri instead of Irene. She also said said instead of said. She replaced the word I with it and said thinks instead of think.
Inri was thankful to Joselito.
She mispronounced the word Irene and said Inrine. She also omitted the word so. She said thankful instead of thankful. She said Joselito instead of Joselito.
As a form of her application,
She read the word appreciation as aptercation.
she told Joselito to go canteen.
She said Joselito instead of Joselito. The word to becomes to. The word go becomes go. She also omitted the words to and the.
With her, they shared
She omitted the word and.
snacks for recess.
The word for was mispronounced as por.
Joselito has great for that because his honesty.
The word Joselito becomes Joselito. She also mispronounced the word was as has. She said great por as instead of grateful. She omitted the word of.
He was able to enjoy his recess time.
She said table instead of able. She also said to instead of to.